Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's presentation. Tonight we have Joan Baum discussing Abraham Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula that did a lot of inspiration and a lot of different areas of theater, art, you name it. Dracula's in the vocabulary. And without further ado, I'll turn over tonight's talk to Joan Baum.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, folks at the library. Thank all of you and people out Zooming. I always like to say why I think of giving a talk on the subject I wind up talking about. And usually my two key answers, which are also the answers I ask myself when I do book reviews, are: one, is it timely? Two, is it significant? There's no question about the timeliness of Dracula. And I'm going to look forward to comments from you on helping me with part two, the significance, a particularly difficult concern to take on at this time in the world, but we'll do it. So the timeliness. Of course, the first obvious reason Dracula, a talk on Dracula is timely, is because it's Halloween time, it's October, and I want to announce to you that my very deep research uncovered that Dracula costumes are number 2, but number 1 are witches. It's also, but you don't have to get excited about this, bat mating season. I knew that would go over. The films keep coming. In fact, when I came in tonight, Steve was not even addressing the serious ones, just all the camp and comic stuff, but they do. And I just took a sample list: Dracula, Dracula's daughter, son of Dracula, the return of Dracula, the horror of Dracula, the House of Dracula, the Bride of Dracula, Dracula, the Prince of Darkness, Billy the Kid versus Dracula, The Blood of Dracula's Castle, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Blackula, and its sequel, Scream, Blackula, Scream. There are to date, and when I gave notes for this talk, probably it's increased, but there are to date, and this is the serious stuff, 161 Dracula movies out there versus only 115 for Frankenstein. And as far as I know, Mel Brooks was the only one to put them together in Young Frankenstein when he sees a kid on the railroad platform and said, you know, hey boy, is this the Transylvania station? Track 29. Anyway, the latest in the timely argument is something that came out this year. And in fact, that prompted me to want to say, why? All these movies, they keep on coming out, if not directly on Dracula, about other people in the movies. And this year was Renfield with Nicolas Cage. It was streaming on Amazon Prime for a while. And I took a look at about 5 minutes. It was terrible. And we'll get into what's terrible and what's good. But Dracula is the second most filmed character in the world of cinema. The first, Sherlock Holmes. Other timely reasons for the talk. There is an annual Stoker Festival in Dublin every October, a 4-day event. There is also a very active Dracula Society. And the president of the society, Julia Crook, who has been president for 40 years, said the emphasis of the group is to talk about Gothic literary fiction. but they also run tours to Transylvania, and they hold their meetings in pubs. The irony, as I'll mention later, is that Bram Stoker, the author of the novel, never went to Transylvania. But the president is adamant about continuing the tradition in Dublin. Stoker was Irish. We love not only the vampire, but werewolves, ghouls, mummies, ghosts, zombies, and other supernatural creatures. And we embrace the tradition of the Gothic novel. It includes Stephen King. She says the group loves horror movies as well, but particularly those with literary resonance. She does, however, note a change over the years in the movies, and it's one that I'm going to emphasize as well, because I think it has to do with the significance of Dracula, the serious stuff. And particularly, just to give you a little foretaste, the big change is how Dracula appears. The first time he was in a 1922 silent horror by Murnau, wonderful director, Nosferatu. And if you ever get a chance to see this silent, it is worth it. It is brilliant photography. And Max Schreck, the actor who plays Dracula, is incredibly ugly with long fingernails. And there are so many incredible shots in that movie where you just see the shadows of the hands. From that, we move very nicely to sexual content, which I will get back to in a moment. And it will be at least some hint of why I think Dracula is significant, because I think all great literature, and it's not great literature, or memorable literature, not only reflects the culture of the day and makes upfront and conscious what's in the air, but also predictably affects new adaptations and new literary achievements. One of the reasons that in the timeliness game, which we're still in, one of the reasons in which that Dracula is so timely is that there are three aspects to it, and particularly not the book, but the movies. And they have helped make the movies, not the book, popular. What's interesting about these three aspects is that they're really not of any big deal in the novel. The first is Transylvania. There's a whole lot of mysterious, exotic, erotic photography going with the movies. Second, vampire bats. Surprisingly, they do not figure prominently in the novel. And the third is a historical reference. Yes, there was a terrible tyrant. That's redundant. His name was Vlad Tepes, otherwise known as Vlad the Impaler. 15th century, a tyrant who was so violent, and of course his nickname, the Impaler, shows you what he did to his victims. And I want to talk about these three aspects because they do feed the Dracula legend, ironically, by pulling away even more from the actual novel. But there's a fourth reason that I want to mention the timeliness of what I have uncovered, and that does feed off the novel in a way that hasn't been yet embraced, and that's the sexuality. I don't know how many of you read Dracula. I thought I did years ago, but when I reread it, my mouth hung open. what was achieved in this Victorian novel. And if you have time at the end, I brought in my edition of Dracula. It looks as though the Count had been nibbling a bit, but it is a gorgeous, gorgeous edition by someone by the name of Leonard Woolf. That was nice. And it's beautifully illustrated. So I totally recommend that. Anyway, Transylvania. Transylvania was, as I said, the leading exotic reason that people thought they were going to read the book, enjoy it, and maybe even go there on the tours. But again, just to go back a second, I wanted to say that there was this one other reason, sexuality, and not just homosexuality. And I do think, risky statement, that that aspect, which has been looked at very carefully in recent years, is driving a lot of the timeliness. A fellow by the name of Dalton Villette, not known to me, but he is the author. He writes historical fiction, and he's the author of an article called The Queer Horror of Dracula. And it came out in 2022. He calls Bram Stoker, the author, a closeted gay. Probably so. And those of you who are aware, at least, of English law popularized by Alan Turing, know that it wasn't until the 1950s that homosexuality was not considered a crime acceptable to death. So what Dalton Villette has done, and what other people are now getting into the spirit of with adaptations, both theatrical and cinematic, is looking at Stoker as a closeted gay and looking particularly, as I did, at some of the love letters he wrote to Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman. They're incredible, and there's absolutely no doubt about their homoerotic content or of Dalton Villette's thesis. And in fact, those of you who might have taken a turn to read the book before today know that at one point when Jonathan Harker, who's the straight up guy who's been asked to go to Transylvania to meet with the Count, who wants to buy a house in England, more people there, Jonathan Harker comes to the castle finally, and he is attacked, kind of, by three ghoulish women. They're gorgeous, though, but they're vampirish. And at the point where one of them is about to do something straight, I shouldn't say straight, Count Dracula makes an appearance and says, and I quote, "Be gone, he's mine." Well, that's also become a very confirming line. Nonetheless, the myths go on about Transylvania, about vampire bats, and even Vlad Tepes as a way of connecting to Dracula and kind of teasing out its significance. Most of the Dracula myths, it's true, come from Slavic folklore, which Bram Stoker read. And most of them are Hungarian, Romanian, Serbo-Croatian, and also Greek. I was told, but I don't recall, having seen Nosferatu, which came out in 1922, this German silent, that at one point, how would we know it's a silent? At one point in the film, there are peasants who were talking in Polish. Okay, but it certainly fed the myth of the exotic, much more so than had it been an English setting. In Stoker's day, and the book was published in 1897, Transylvania was under Hungarian rule, and most people in the area being Hungarian. However, 79,000 were gypsies who were carrying a lot of the folklore tales, and 29,000 were Jews. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because there are bizarre aspects about Jewish identity in Dracula. 2, the vampire bats, of course. Why were the vampire bats so quickly in the popular imagination associated with Dracula? That's because when Dracula came out in the late 19th century, one of the leading diseases was syphilis. Syphilis, in its 3rd stage, results in madness. And people feared, of course, as they always do, disease. In fact, I came across an article that came out just this past June through Reuters News, and I quote, "Viruses that jump from animals to humans are the likely sources of major health threats, and bats are the #1 suspect." Actually, in the book, rats are more prominent. They're on the ship that takes the count from Transylvania to England. But they don't really figure very much in the book. And by the way, this book that I mentioned is over 300 pages. And Dracula himself as a character appears in only 60. So there's a really weird disproportion there. Anyway, the bat association with Dracula continues, even though there doesn't seem the force of the actual book to support it. Recently, the New York Times had a review of a book called The Theory of Everything, and I read the review. The author of the book said a particular kind of madness has always been associated with bat excrement, guano, which is a fertilizer. And we have these expressions, batshit crazy, bats in the belfry, batty. But I watched that association of the bats, disease, and madness, and I think that is what is stressed in Renfield, this movie that Nicolas Cage just came out with, because the fear of madness because of syphilis is quite real. So we have the bats, even though they're not legitimately related to the book in proportion. The third, Vlad Tepes. Yes, there was a Vlad the Third, who signed his letters Dracula. And this was in the late 1470s. His father was Vlad Dracul, the dragon, and the peasants who were terrified of his rule kind of kept that fiction going along with the fact of his horror. But in the book, Dracula, the Count, is a sole character. He moves alone. He's no tyrant. And I remember being surprised at what a number of people have pointed out. He doesn't attack people. He may in all the crazy sequels. But what happens in the book is, and he says this to Jonathan Harker when he first arrives, the lawyer or accountant from England in Transylvania, he says, step in at your own free will. And he also says that to Mina, one of the 2 women who figure in the book. And see him flapping at the window in the movie. But in both the book and the movie, he kind of gets into her unconscious and says, in effect, open the window. He doesn't barge through and attack her, and she does. And this has been pointed out, this willingness of the so-called victims of Dracula to invite their fate. Don't forget, it's too far from Sigmund Freud, and it's not too far from what I learned in a graduate student, that the so-called Victorian age was quite pornographic. In fact, at one point I was going to do a dissertation on a friend of William Blake, who was a member of the Royal Academy. And he did a number of gorgeous Michelangelo type sculptured drawings. He was for the theater. And all the drawings are clearly pornographic, obscene at least. But I couldn't do it because the artist, his name was Fuseli. And at the time in my graduate school, you had to know Italian. You couldn't rely on anyone else's translations. And so we have all of these traditions, whether they're legitimate or not, feeding into the Dracula legend. Some of you may also remember, and this was very much a reason why Dracula became so popular, a woman by the name of Anne Rice. Interview with the Vampire, you got it. This was an incredible franchise, both literary and in the movies. And she invented a character, Lestat de Liancourt, a French nobleman who was turned into a vampire in the 18th century. It's really high-toned romance with a quite a twist. The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice sold 80 million copies. I had an opportunity to review or interview her after one of her books came out, but it was during a stage later in life when she decided that her argument with the Catholic Church was going to be eased and she was going back, sins and all, and she refused to discuss any of the Vampire Chronicles with me. Strange to say, she died about 2 or 3 years ago. And right before she died, she had another moment and decided to give the vampire one more shot. And of course, the estate was very happy. Clearly, though, the Vampire Chronicles, if you've read one, you've read a number, have a homoerotic content. So the sexuality is there. It's in Stoker. I'll quote a couple of passages that will make your mouth hang open. And I don't remember this from when I first read the novel. But clearly, of all the timely reasons for wanting to give a talk on Dracula, the main attractions are the movies. And no, I'm not going to list all 116, but some to note. If you haven't seen the Nosferatu, which is, I said, a German expressionist, gorgeous piece of cinematography, please do. It's silent, but it's dazzling for anyone interested in photography. After that, and for many people still, the Dracula movie was Bela Lugosi's in 1931. And there's no doubt, if you take a look at the movie, even snippets of it, that he is no Nosferatu character. In fact, he's a very talented actor, was a very talented actor, and he started the tradition of the cape. The actress who played Mina, one of his victims, said he was so sexy, she could hardly concentrate on her lines. Lugosi once did Frankenstein's monster with Boris Karloff doing Dracula. They were friendly, and just for camp reasons they did that. But that is still the movie that many people say is it. No one did him better. And I'll show you a picture. The press was kind enough to run a little notice of the talk with one of the poster pictures of Bela Lugosi. And I have it here, and I'm going to mention something about it in a few minutes that will really surprise you. Then there was Christopher Lee. He does a lot of hissing, and he opened his shirt, and he showed his naked chest and his bloodline, and Mina had to drink. Okay, a little too much, but I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to see. First, it was a play, and then it was a movie. Frank Langella in 1979. Let me tell you, the theater went dead quiet. That was just about the closest thing to fellatio I've seen on a stage. And he said he would do the movie, but he said not if he has to wear fangs. No kidding. He wore a V-neck shirt. His chest hair was showing. And as he moved across the stage, I thought the play was even sexier than the movie, probably fewer restrictions. You could just hear the audience gasping, men and women. In 1992, Francis Ford Coppola got into the act with Gary Oldman as Dracula. Nice, some writhing around erotically. And in the scenes where the brides come out, Dracula's three brides, to kind of torture Jonathan, it's very clear they're doing it in a sexual way, but they're also speaking Romanian. Okay. Then there was a 2000 film with Christopher Plummer as Van Helsing. And I noticed that as the movies advanced, the named actors were not Dracula. They were Van Helsing, the expert who comes to figure out what's going on. And I found that interesting too, because there were some incredible actors who took that role. Now I understand that Nosferatu, which means the undead, kind of loose translation, is being reshot and updated. And it was noted in Esquire magazine this past August. Talk about timely. So there are a lot of timely reasons for the talk of the legend, but there are certainly new emphases. One, as I said, the sexual content, hetero and now homosexual. When Harker shows up in the castle, he's just been engaged to Mina, and they're separated. He's unhappy, he's lonely, and he is attacked by the women. And I want to read you what happens. The brides come out, and he clearly in the book wants to kiss them. One critic says that this clearly reflects men's fears that Stoker captured at the time of women who were sexually aggressive. It was also, and I think you see this in a lot of Victorian literature, men felt wanted bad boys, and men couldn't deliver. Thus, the women were turned into devils, voluptuous, ladies with red curved lips. The brides in the book bend over Harker, one on her knees. The women approach him and fill him, quote, with a wicked, burning desire. Remember, this is a Victorian novel. And then I quote, there was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive to him as she arched her neck. She actually licked her lips like an animal. Lower, lower went her head. The skin on his throat began to tickle. Quote, inside quote. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. I mean, the prose is not to be admired, but the scene certainly is. And she makes this bride, she makes a chewing sound with her tongue. I don't know how we all missed that when we read Stoker early on. It's also been said that, and I think the Renfield movie that came out with Nicolas Cage kind of has this in it. I read because I couldn't stay with the actual film. There's a wonderful French expression, la petite mort, the little death, which has always been assigned to the feeling after orgasm. And it means the brief loss or weakening of consciousness. And clearly, if you look the word up, the dictionaries will indicate it's a sensation that has been likened to a little death, la petite mort. So it's a stage of consciousness. It's also a stage of spiritual release. And it was first used this way 3 years after the publication of Dracula. Dracula took 7 years to write. So here is Victorian England, again, defying all the assumptions we have. By the way, I was friendly with a guy in graduate school who wound up writing a wonderful book. And I say wonderful because I think he was the first to do it. And it was called The Victorians, the other Victorians, not the ones who were biblically okay, but all the ones who were suspect. And I got to thinking how often periods and eras are named for what they're not. The 18th century, with its first massive revolutions, was called the Age of Reason. So was the clear question you should ask me, and I've asked myself, is, was Bram Stoker aware of all of these sexual implications, or am I just up here making this stuff up? I do believe he was. And I say that not just because the culture supported him, but I think his own life did as well. His dates are 1847 to 1912. Came from Dublin. He was raised Protestant. He went to Trinity College, and he had a big interest in science and a hatred of superstition. Again, just the opposite impression that many readers come away with. He was buried, by the way, and this is one of the oddities I wanted to bring up. It's a non sequitur, but what the heck. He was buried in a place in London called Golders Green. And Golders Green has been and was at the time a center for Jewish populations. Now, when you have a moment later, come up and look at this poster. You can get this online, by the way, and blow it up to make sure that it's so. But this is Bela Lugosi, and he's in his Dracula cape, and he has a kind of cravat around his neck, and hanging from it, I don't know how I never, ever saw this before, is a Star of David. Now, what do you do with that? Over the years, people have asserted that Dracula was the novel contains anti-Semitic content. I don't believe that. I've reread it. I think there are stereotypes in there, but I don't think they're Jewish in particular. I also have heard that Bram Stoker was Jewish, and I don't know that that's so either, except for the fact that he was buried in this Jewish area. I can't figure it out. He was married. He was married to a gorgeous, absolutely beautiful woman, Florence Balcom, who sued Nosferatu for adapting Dracula without her permission. She was a beauty. So wasn't he gay? Yes, he was. But she was courted by Oscar Wilde, who absolutely adored her. And when she married Stoker, he was devastated. So there we are with a number of mysteries. Bram Stoker was a man of the theater. And for 27 years, his job was as business manager for the West End Lyceum Theater that was owned by Sir Henry Irving, who was the first Sir to have become knighted. And I love the original name. I just thought I'd have to tell you. Irving's original name was John Henry Broaddrib. That's almost as good as, or maybe as good as, Trump's original name, Drumpf. So the same Germanic emphasis being eased out. The novel itself, I hope you get a chance to read. It's an epistolary novel, and I think that's fascinating also because it presents all the facts from at least 7 characters' point of view. And now that's become almost a staple, if not a parody, of a lot of contemporary fiction. But you get a sense of Dracula, of the madness of science at the time, from all these different points of view. Another thing, I'm surprised that women's clubs, feminist clubs, haven't picked this up. Although the novel's been called sexist because of when it came out and the attacks on the poor innocent guys, I think it's really quite a picture of independent women like Mina. She is strong. She leads the group to find out what's going on with the madness and the count who's just arrived. And she is a working woman. Gonna get married. She's not gonna give up her job. The book contains, it's been said, a lot of Stoker's impressions of how threatened men were with women like Mina. And so you get a very rich cultural history, which I think is worth looking at again. The novel also has, even though it's not great literature, some fabulous scenes. The opening, the creepy ride as Jonathan Harker goes to the castle in Transylvania, even though, and I have pictures of the real castle that Bram Stoker relied on. It's in Scotland. And he stayed there and probably was moved to write the book. But it sounds better if it's in Transylvania. There's also the famous one scene where Harker looks out and sees Dracula as a kind of huge bat going face down, climbing down the wall, a cloak-like huge wings. And there's no doubt in my mind that T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland took that image. And it is in The Wasteland, the section 5, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings and crawled head downward down a blackened wall. First of all, that's gorgeous poetry, but that's clearly right out of Bram Stoker. Good. Of course, the part that I read before of poor Jonathan Harker being attacked by these women and dying to be attacked. There also are terrific scenes of Dracula's ship arriving in England. And there's no doubt in my mind that Stoker was taking an image from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Just gorgeous. So there's the timeliness. I need your help with the significance. What I thought about, and maybe I'm pushing it, is that I really haven't talked about Dracula. I've talked about the changing image of the various editions and movies and what they reflect of the culture of the time. And it occurs to me that the Dracula legend is worth looking at and considering. And that's what I think is significant, just as I think it's significant that Oppenheimer, the book was American Prometheus, took the Prometheus myth, the old days of Aeschylus, when Prometheus stole fire to give to man. He was not forgiven. He didn't do that. Chthonic justice ruled. But then, as the history moved on, you come to Frankenstein, whose subtitle is The Modern Prometheus. Her husband wrote an absolutely gorgeous poetic epic called Prometheus Unbound, as an answer to Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. And then we have the J.R. Oppenheimer story called The American Prometheus. And again, the changing image of someone who is technically able to manipulate science in the interest of mankind. And you move from the guy who offended Zeus to Oppenheimer, at least a wonderfully ambiguous picture of someone who meant well until he decided there were terrible effects. And I think this is where the Dracula legend is going. And if I had to say, maybe we'll have an AI Dracula somehow. But the legend keeps on widening with interests more in madness, in women, in homosexuality. And it led me to think that that is the heart of what all literature does when we are moved by it, whether it's great or not. It presents a legend. And one of the thrills in reading is to watch how that legend has changed. And it led me to think that I'd like to do another talk in the spring on another legend, and that is Machiavelli's The Prince and Strong Man. Anyway, thank you so much for bearing with me, and I'll be very happy to take your questions, probably no answers or just comments. Good evening. Surely. How many people here, I'm just curious, have ever, as I did, have read Dracula or thought they did? Do you remember any of this sexuality? Anne says yes. I didn't pick it up either, but it is so apparent. And as the critics today are pointing out, particularly the homosexuality. I should have said, by the way, that probably there is agreement in the fact that Bram Stoker had a very long affair with Sir Henry Irving, who owned the Lyceum Theater. So even though he was married to Florence, Florence was courted by Oscar Wilde. And 2 years after the book came out, of course, Oscar Wilde was thrown in jail. It was a horribly miserable last couple of years for him in Paris, but a fabulous writer, probably the wittiest in all of English literature. So thank you for bearing with me, not just to talk about Dracula, but to hustle you into all these other side currents to read. It's a wonderful, not great in sense of prose, but it is a wonderful cultural experience. And do take a look at this book. The drawings are just incredible. I mean, it's like Doré on steroids. Gustave Doré. They're just beautiful. So if you do get a copy, you can, I'm sure, get that on AOL. Yes. Please. No, I can't answer that because I haven't, but I would say it's not a question of valid. Do I see where it comes from? You bet. And I guess that's one of the things I'm saying, that, you know, we don't realize tapping the well of how much an original gets sourced out beautifully. And that is, again, part of the significance that a legend keeps moving. Save yourself from Nicolas Cage. But the women have it. And as I said, the picture of Mina is pretty much modern. And for anyone interested in the growth of the women's movement, you can see reflected not only that Stoker takes up an admirable position about Mina Harker, but that he allows that others are a little unnerved of it because she's so independent. Well, you know, if you describe the original, that sounds queer too. By the way, I should have added that when the second round of interest came up in the Dracula legend, it was coincident with the outbreak of HIV. And just as the earlier one was coincident with syphilis, which everyone brought back, this was fearful and blood and fearing. And there's a lot about transfusions in here. And as I said, that we don't have time to go into it, but when you think about Stoker as hostile to superstition and wanting science to lead the way, you can even conclude that his presentation of this Van Helsing character and all the way institutions were run for the mad, absolutely fabulous cultural evidence. So I wouldn't, you know, get a copy of the book and read to the kiddies coming around to trick or treat. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.